The capitalist class spends a great deal of money trying to get you to buy shit that you don't need. They have erected a vast, extensive ad industry that exists solely for the purpose of manipulating desire on a subconscious level so as to mold the behavior of consumers to their liking. In the early days of marketing, advertisements spoke merely to the objective qualities of commodities.
They shave incredibly close too, so close we dare to match shaves with any blade. Norelco rotary blade.
But over time they realized that to really sell stuff, you have to go beyond rational thought. You have to address people's most intense desires. But commodities can never really be the objects of our most intense desires. Most of all, people desire intangible things, like social approbation, a sense of belonging, confidence, a unique sense of self, sexual fulfillment. This created a basic problem for advertising. Their job was to get people to have an intense desire to buy stuff that they didn't actually have an intense desire to buy. And so, advertisers did the most logical thing from the bourgeois point of view, which, in true Orwellian fashion, is also the most absurd thing to do. They decided to make people associate commodities with intangible desires. Shoes that give you confidence and identity. Beer brings you social approbation. Cars bestow power and success.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1980.
It's only possible to do this if you can suspend people's rational thought. Ironically, economists call this rationalizing consumption. And this is actually pretty easy to do because, to vulgarize Freud, human beings are largely ruled by an underlying layer of unconscious impulses. So, after capitalism commodified social relations in space, it went on to commodify desire. And now that we live in a world where we act out our subjective desire largely through the consumption of commodities which can never actually fulfill our desires, we find ourselves immersed in a very cynical age. We have a profound suspicion of any belief in objective principles of truth, of common political projects, hence the rise of both cultural apathy and reactionary fundamentalisms. This all contrasts starkly with one of the most basic claims of bourgeois economics. Let me quote here from an old college textbook from Exchange and Production in Bourgeois Economics by Michael E. Staton. He says, An inescapable fact of our existence is that our collective desires and goals exceed our productive ability. And later on, the primary question to be investigated is how a society manages to coordinate the production of goods to satisfy consumer demands. Literally, how does it harness the competitive behavior of millions of individuals in order to get goods and services produced? We can raise several objections to this idea that in a capitalist society, production is oriented merely toward fulfilling consumer desires. For one, if capitalism merely provides us with our subjective desires, why is the collective result of our consumption something that nobody likes? 2. How is technological progress driven by desire? For instance, people didn't need electricity before electricity was invented. Electricity was invented, and we built a society around electricity, which structured our needs in a way in which we now need electricity. So obviously there's some other element in the equation other than subjective desires and technological progress. 3. Can my desires really be fulfilled by consuming drugs and yogurt? Like, is this the extent of my desires as a human being? After the initial excitement of buying a pair of tennis shoes or drinking a beer, am I more fulfilled as a person? Is society better? And lastly, to quote my main man Slavoj Žižek, there's nothing objective about desire.
Our desires are artificial. We have to be taught to desire.
And this is why the capitalist class spends trillions of dollars every year trying to teach you to want stuff. Once again, empirical reality contradicts the basic tenets of bourgeois economics. Perhaps this mistake stems from confusing simple commodity production with capitalist commodity production. In simple commodity production, I make something, let's say I make a shoe. I sell it for money to someone who wants it. I use that money to buy something I want, say a toothbrush or a bunch of toothbrushes. I've basically exchanged something I don't want for something I do want. We represent the circuit as CMC, commodity exchanging for money, exchanging for commodity. Once the money is being re-exchanged for another commodity, the circuit stops. But capitalist commodity production works in exactly the opposite way. The capitalist starts the day off with money capital. He uses it to buy commodities of raw materials, machines, and workers, which produce finished commodities. He then sells these commodities for more money than he started with. We represent this as MCM prime, or money, commodities, more money. The cycle then continues the next day, but now with more money in the initial investment. Hence, the economy grows. So capitalist production, in contrast to simple commodity production, is quantitatively oriented rather than qualitatively oriented. That is, while a consumer is concerned about buying particular qualities of many different commodities, particular uses, the capitalist is concerned merely with getting a greater quantity of the same thing, money. Capitalist production is driven by this search for profit, not by the need to fulfill subjective needs. After commodities have been produced, after value is created by workers, then capitalists must go out into the marketplace and try to sell all these things they just made. This is called the realization problem. Capitalists must realize the values of the commodities they have made. If they can't realize this value, they have a problem. The circuit of capital, MCM, is incomplete, with capital stuck in commodity form. Hence the need to influence consumer habits, to keep MCM perpetually in motion. But if capitalism produces merely for profit, without regard necessarily for consumption, is there a limit to how much it can grow? Won't it run into a problem if it produces more than it can consume? Well, yes. The argument that crisis is caused by the overproduction of commodities, for which there is a lack of demand for, is called the underconsumption argument. The underconsumption argument is one of the oldest theories of capitalist crisis and has many variations, some Marxist, some not. Today we consider the underconsumption argument a flawed argument, yet a brief analysis of the underconsumption argument and its problems will be quite useful for our larger investigation of capitalist crisis. The basic question behind underconsumption is this: if capitalist production is always expanding, where does the new demand come from to buy back all this new stuff? Some simple algebra may help us here. The total value of all the commodities in the economy is equal to V plus C plus S, where V is the money spent on variable capital. Remember, that's just a fancy word for wages paid to workers. C on constant capital. These are finished goods made by other workers like tools, electricity, machines. And S for the surplus value that human labor adds to the commodity. In other words, human labor creates all the value in the commodity. This value is divided into three pieces: the part going to workers as wages, V, the part going to other capitalists for producing machines, C, and the part going to capitalists as profit, S. That profit was value created by workers. Since at a macro level, the value of C is also just V plus S. In other words, since machines and tools are also products of human labor produced under conditions of exploitation, then ultimately the value of all commodities is merely V plus S. I hope I don't get in trouble for making that simplification. Assuming workers spend all of their wages on commodities, they'll be able to buy back the total amount of value in the economy up to the level of total wages. But that's not enough to buy back all of the rest of the value in society, because the total value of commodities is V plus S, wages plus profits. The question for the underconsumptionist is, where does the rest of that value come from to pay for S, to pay for the rest of the value of commodities? And to find out the answer to that question, you'll have to click down below on the second part of this video, right after you hit subscribe and favorite and send it to all your friends.